Welcome to Sankofa Summer School. Oh my gosh, I can't even tell you how excited I am. For the next 3 weeks, we will be providing you with education that we believe is essential to your expansion and growth. Sankofa Summer School is an Afrocentric academy that takes place every summer, and it's an opportunity for you to come and expand your knowledge base and to learn new things from experts and people who are really passionate about educating others. So we are starting tonight, and I'm very, very, very excited to present to you my friend, my colleague, someone that I've gotten to know pretty well over the last few years. Her name is Dr. Courtney Carr. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She recently earned her PhD in Africology and African American Studies from Temple University. She received a Master in Arts degree in Pan-African Studies from Syracuse University and a Bachelor of Arts in Africana Studies from Cornell University. Courtney's research interests include Afrocentricity, Afrofuturism, non-governmental organization discourse, transnational feminisms, and unpacking narrative formulations about women impacted by female genital cutting. And let me tell you something, you are in for an amazing treat. This woman is so smart and brilliant. We are honored to have her returning to Sankofa Summer School for her second time. And without further ado, I'm going to welcome my good sister, Courtney, to the stage. I'm going to load her slides and she's going to take over, and you all are going to have an amazing time. Okay? Bye.
Thank you so much for having me. Like you already said, Sankofa Summer School is an important project to my personal academic journey and to my heart because of all the transformative knowledge that we have on stage here today. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So I'm going to be talking about unraveling Africa's heart of darkness, the Afrocentric lens as a demonstrative tool. And you'll really understand exactly what I'm talking about and exactly what all of these maybe academic jargony terms mean once I go through all of the information. But as was mentioned, a lot of the things that I focus on in terms of my research has a lot to do with female genital cutting. And so basically, I'm going to be using an Afrocentric lens to get us to the finish line of my framework that I utilize when I think about and talk about female genital cutting, which was basically what I did my dissertation on here at Temple. So I want to provide us with an Afrocentric statement that will also be utilized throughout all of the other lessons or workshops throughout the week for Sankofa Summer School. So Dr. Molefi Kete-Asante developed Afrocentricity as a theoretical framework in the 1980s. Since then, brilliant scholars have expanded the Afrocentric paradigm, giving us a template to guide our educational praxis. Simply put, being Afrocentric means centering Africana people in their own narratives and making them the subjects, not the objects of other people's stories. And I'll get into the exact value of that statement and the larger implications of it. Because what does it mean for African people to be the subjects and not the objects of other people's stories? It arguably is telling us that African people have been objectified in their own histories and in storytelling, and through Afrocentricity, we're deconstructing that. For most of us, our learning experiences have been primarily Eurocentric. And again, I'll get into that and detail that, some examples of that for sure throughout this presentation. We learned that European ways of knowing and being are best and universally applicable. Afrocentricity challenges this notion of European or white supremacy and encourages us to center ourselves as Africana people first and foremost. We take this approach because it is empowering and it is true. What does it mean when we center ourselves and when we decenter or dislocate Eurocentricity and its impact on our intellectual selves? We'll be really thinking about what that could mean and how that could materialize in the way we consume media, for example, throughout this presentation. So as my title suggests, something that I'm going to be talking about heavily throughout this presentation is the heart of darkness. And many of you probably may not have heard of this book. I hadn't heard of it For one, it was published in 1899, years before my own time. But this book, Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness, really implicated in many ways how the world thinks about and views Black people. And it's oftentimes not talked about enough because it was a book established in 1899. But a lot of the thoughts that Joseph Conrad was putting together in this book was something that really largely implicated a lot of the stereotypes that we commonly associate with African people, with Black people. And even if we look at the cover of this book, we see this jungle-like space, we see a river, a boat, trees, this really jungle-like atmosphere that is equated with the so-called African savage that I'm going to get into a little later. We can also think about the ways in which this book pedestalized Joseph Conrad as an author. He became a writer of his time, a Polish writer whose words really, in the Eurocentric eye, spoke to the experience of colonialism and imperialism, but through an Afrocentric lens, which we'll talk about later, we can really unpack and unravel how destructive, arguably, the words that Joseph Conrad put together about Black people were. And again, its larger implications into what we know to be untrue and dishonest about how people have interpreted and discerned African people to be. Again, a really dishonest interpretation. So a lot of what was stereotypically put out about Black people from Joseph Conrad's book was that Africa was this monolith. And what do I mean by a monolith? When I think about the word monolith, I think about some of those sci-fi movies where people put those like stationary blocks of metal in spaces to render a space almost alien. And in a similar way, they wanted to render African people alien. They wanted to have a rigid interpretation of how we see Africa as one country in many ways. We still hear people talking about Africa as if it's one country when it's a continent with 54 countries. That oftentimes is disregarded and dismissed because of the foundation that this text put in. And I think this mask that we have featured here on this slide is really evocative of some of the thinking of authors like Frantz Fanon, who talks about how Black people are wearing these masks, Black skin, white masks, and how the African psyche has been convoluted by colonialism. So really what we have on our slideshow already is symbolic of exactly how the Africa as a intricate continent has been almost deranged to be considered something other than what it is. It has a lot of richness and diversity. It's heterogeneous, not homogenous. But that's what a lot of these interpretations and stereotypes arguably set out to have Africa seen in this unitary way, not unifying, but in a unilateral way, I should say, in a one-way street sort of way. So if we think about the dark continent stereotype about Africa, it's really suggesting that it's really coinciding with that whole terminology, sub-Saharan Africa, that Africa is beneath the rest of the world. But when we think about how mapping and cartography implicates the way that we think, we understand the terminology of a so-called dark continent to be disruptive, to not be true, because, and similarly, the term sub-Saharan Africa is illogical and doesn't make sense because the cartographies oftentimes center Europe as the center of the world, when in reality it's not. And actually the sizing of many maps renders the African continent to be a lot smaller than it realistically is. And so in a similar tune and voice, Joseph Conrad was replicating those ideologies that Africa as a continent was insignificant, was darkened, was small. The people, a darkened demographic, when we know that not to be true about African people. So we really have to deconstruct and break apart a lot of what Joseph Conrad was saying about African people, because again, it is dishonest. And in tune with this dark continent, he talked a lot about African people as being the so-called savage. So what does it mean that African people were the savage? They were primitive, they were animal-like. I'm going to put some quotes on the screen in a bit showing how he thought of African people to be animals, to be akin to a creature unlike who the European man was. And that is very in line with the time period that he was responding to. So Joseph Conrad wrote his book in 1899. The Berlin Conference happens in 1848, where they divvy up Africa and put all of these borders onto continental Africa. And so we are getting rhetoric to substantiate why they divided Africa the way that they did. We're getting a lot of words to think about the African person as less than, and the continent as darkened, as sub-Saharan, in order to substantiate why they conquered a territory, colonized a territory, divvied up a territory to make it financially substantial for their exploitation. And in many ways, we see a lot of these narratives still replicating themselves, that they're saying African people are exploitable, are colonial, or able to be colonized, are pillageable, because they want to continue to substantiate ways in which they extract resources from continental Africa. So we have to be able to think about these stereotypes and how they're materializing in our day-to-day now, and how they're substantiating some really horrible things across the globe. Another narrative that they put forth is the narrative of the victim, that the African person is a victim, needs help, needs to be colonized in order to be civilized. And we also know that to be false. The African person also has to be primitive, exotic, all of these derogatory terms in order to substantiate why colonialism is needed. And again, we know these to be dishonest. We know that there are lineages of kings and queens within continental Africa that happened years and years prior to the scramble for Africa. We know that African people had intellectual production in Kemet, and they were teaching the thinkers that get pedestalized today, such as Pythagoras, for their mathematics and things like that. So we know that there was a richness in thought that always existed in continental Africa. So these so-called ideologies surrounding the African person cannot be true, because the pyramids, all of the hieroglyphs, meta nature, all of these different forms of thought existed way before colonialism was happening, way before the scramble for Africa. But again, in order to substantiate the colonialism, in order to substantiate the desire to continue to extract resources from continental Africa, the white savior also had to exist. This white savior was a distinctive white body that was elevated, really leaning on Enlightenment thought. They were elevated from the African, and they could save the African from their so-called primitive condition. Going back to this notion of the exotic, this is a lot of the ideologies that's still heavily utilized to substantiate the exoticization of Black women. To say that a Black woman is exotic is in a way to continue this narrative of her capability of being conquered and pillaged. So we need to continue to deconstruct these myths, especially in how they materialize today. So in order to do that, we have to understand who we are and who we have always been. And I think Afrocentricity serves as a tool for us to understand who we are and who we have always been. So again, as I said, some examples of how this animal-like or savage notion and ideology continue to materialize in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. We see him say, a lot of people, mostly Black and naked, moved about like ants. So in his mind, it's important to think that right now he's imagining African people through a voyeuristic lens. And what does that mean? He's looking at it as a colonial explorer or missionary. So he's seeing Black people's mere movements to be similar to an ant being an animal that's smaller than his sort of myopic eye in many ways, and also an animal that moves fast, that isn't necessarily seen to the naked eye. So he's relegating a level of insignificance immediately through his rhetoric. In his next example, he says, they howled and leaped, talking about the Black people that he's encountering. Now, his story was set in the Congo River, but again, that's not specified enough. So it's in the Congo River. They're saying about the African people that he's interacting with. They howled and leaped and spun and made horrid faces. But what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity, like yours, the thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar, ugly. So again, he sees the European as remote compared to the African people that he's seen, that he's interacting with, whose faces he describes as horrid. He compares them arguably to these primitive creatures who are howling and leaping, whose humanity is very different and divergent from his. So again, it's substantiating the fact that they need a white savior to civilize them, to save them, to cure them of their so-called ugliness, which again, we know that not to be true from an Afrocentric lens, which I will repeat and contextualize later on in this presentation. Last but not least, another quote from the text that's worth highlighting is when he says, the prehistoric man was cursing us, praying to us, welcoming us. Who could tell? So this is a prime example of how he didn't even know what the interactions he was having with the people in the Congo was. He didn't know whether or not they were cursing or welcoming folks. So he was really trying to make sense of it. But each would necessitate a very different reaction. So we can understand the interactions between Joseph Conrad's narrator and the people of the Congo to be nuanced, because how could one interact effectively and with truth and with empowerment when they don't know if the person that they're or the people that they're talking about are cursing, praying, or being welcomed? So I think really seeing how they're developing stereotypes is really important. So another image that I'm going to talk about, or compare, I should say, to Joseph Conrad's work is this piece, The Heart of Darkness, or an image of Africa racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So this is a piece by Chinua Achebe. So I really want to contextualize who Chinua Achebe is and was, and why his rhetoric really is a juxtaposition to Joseph Conrad. So he's more famously known for his work, Things Fall Apart. That's a common reading in a lot of high schools. And that's really cast as a significant pillar within African literature. But I would argue that even Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart gets pedestalized as this monolithic piece that's speaking about the entire continental Africa, when in fact, if you read between the lines in the book, he's only talking about Nigeria, really, and he's critiquing colonialism through Nigeria as a primary example. So that's how we can characterize the intellectual contributions that Chinua Achebe is making and how he's critiquing Joseph Conrad. And more importantly, how we can see directly from the title, is calling out Joseph Conrad's racism in his Heart of Darkness. And Chinua Achebe's critiques really were a stepping stone for Afrocentric thought, and a stepping stone for thinking about how we have to continuously be deconstructing knowledge that's considered normative but is absolutely Eurocentrically implicated. So to summarize some of the things that he talks about in his piece, he's talking about how the Africa or the image of Africa becomes an other world, a quote unquote other world in Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. It becomes an antithesis of Europe and therefore civilization, a place where man's vaunted intelligence and refinement are mocked by triumphant bestiality. So we think about those notions of howled and leap and how that's creating a so-called beast in the reader's mind. He deconstructs Conrad's description of his interaction with the so-called African man as the earth seeming unearthly. And in a lot of the work that I do, I often talk about this notion of an alien and how in a lot of medical spaces, for example, the African body is rendered alien. And we can see that foregrounding happening in Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness, that he is rendering the African body alien because of how primitive it is, savage it is, exotic it is. And Chinua Achebe really gave language to that. I would argue it's almost an Afrofuturistic way of viewing how Joseph Conrad is talking about African people, because he's talking about how Joseph Conrad is decentering or dislocating the African body from the earth, almost rendering it unearthly, which is really important to think about how African people and their bodies are being rendered as other. So, as Achebe highlights in his work, The Heart of Darkness is the rhetorical fodder, or it feeds Eurocentricity because of how it sets up Africa as a foil to Europe. Continental Africa becomes a failure of how European colonization did not work, as a place of negotiations at once remote and vaguely familiar. So he uses these nuanced languages, these metaphors, right? Talking about how African people are howling and leaping to create elusive language and metaphors about how African people can be conceived of as the other. But of course, we know them to be human, to be far from the other, to be proprietors of their own destiny, to be writers of their own storybooks, and the list goes on. I also like to contextualize what Chinua Achebe talks about in his piece. I'm going to go back to my previous slide. So I like to contextualize what Chinua Achebe talks about in this piece with what Bell Hooks describes as the zone of encounter in her article, Eating the Other. She talks about how there's almost a sense of desire that is evoked when African people or the colonizer and the colonized interact with each other. And again, she calls this a zone of encounter or an encounter zone, something along those lines. And she describes this as how the desire for the other is expressed, manipulated, and transformed by encounters with difference and the different, a critical terrain that can indicate whether these potentially revolutionary longings are fulfilled. And so she's really curating a notion of how colonization sort of emits a sense of desire, that there is arousal that the colonizer is getting when he colonizes the colonized. And we can almost presume that from this language of ant-like that Joseph Conrad constructs, because of how he's trying to immediately and metaphorically contemplate the African person as smaller, a very smaller creature than he is. So those are important things to think about. I also wanted to talk about in terms of this notion of the African savage that Joseph Conrad constructs. I wanted to mention how that's rooted in pseudoscience. So around the same time as the Berlin Conference is happening, we have physicians like Samuel Cartwright happening, like many OBGYNs who were experimenting on Black women's bodies. That's a whole other presentation paragraph that many of the fathers of modern medicine that we know now experimented on Black bodies, particularly OBGYNs, to furnish their intellectual thoughts and things like that, and a lot of the so-called science that they developed. We can also include physician Samuel Cartwright in that sort of derogatory history because of how he was the foundation of what many would call pseudoscience, because he was making up thought patterns that said that Black people had smaller brains, biologically smaller brains than their white counterparts, that enslaved people, when they ran away, they had a mental disease, a sickness called drapetomania, when in fact all they wanted was freedom. And so a lot of these different stereotypes, these ideologies, they're feeding one another. They're feeding this plane of thought that scholars will call Eurocentricity. Certainly Chinua Achebe calls it that in his article, An Image of Africa. And that really is a window into understanding how we think about what is called knowledge production now. A lot of what we consume on media and things like that is heavily infiltrated by Eurocentric thought. And I think scholars like Chinua Achebe have provided critiques so that we can deconstruct and unravel what we consider as commonplace knowledge within lots of platforms that we consume even to this day. And so as a counteract to Afrocentricity, or as a counteract to Eurocentricity, but I think it's a lot more complicated than that, because I know a lot of scholars would say that Afrocentricity is not a counteract to Eurocentricity. It stands on its own. But Afrocentricity is a demonstrative tool, or it's a tool that can be used to discuss how we think about African people, or how African people think about themselves. And so some important things to think about in terms of how Afrocentricity can be used as a demonstrative tool is that for an African to assert their agency, it is not a racist act, but a profoundly anti-racist act, because it liberates the African from the dislocation that may have been created by Europeans and undermines any sense of European hegemony. So through Afrocentricity, African people are not a homogenous monolith, but rather have a sense of agency that locates them onto a stratosphere of empowerment. So we very well could use Afrocentricity as a tool to deny the many false claims that Joseph Conrad made in The Heart of Darkness. Again, I want to reiterate, because I heard myself say it before, that Afrocentricity is not a response to Eurocentricity, but rather stands on its own as a separate school of thought that opens the space for African people to see themselves as the center of their own phenomena. So through that lens, African people can gain a sense of agency and can determine what their human beingness means for them. In more recent iterations of Afrocentricity, I'm thinking about Nadav and Malefi Asante's book, Being Human Being. They assert that African people are being African by just being, by just existing, and that we do not have to subscribe to the hierarchies of humanity that society has placed onto African people in order to deconstruct these different silos of thought and tropes that Eurocentricity have put African people into. Afrocentricity is also about location. I would argue the sense of Jed, or groundedness, precisely because African people have been operating from the fringes of the Eurocentric experience. Much of what we know about African history and culture, or literature and linguistics, or politics, and many other subjects is implicated by Eurocentricity. And as I was saying, it's become a really prolific sense of thought that many people can't decipher between what they've understood to be so-called common sense or common knowledge and what's actually a Eurocentric way of knowing. So literature, linguistics, politics, economics, has been orchestrated from the standpoint of Europe's interest. That's what the rest of that quote says. I know it got cut off in the slide, but much of what we have studied in African history and culture, or literature and linguistics, or politics and economics has been orchestrated from the standpoint of Europe's interests. And so what does that mean? That a lot of what we see as African history has been seen through a Eurocentric eye. So when we talk about, it could be anything. I'll talk about female genital cutting for sure. But even when we talk about Egypt, for example, it's been Eurocentrized because a lot of people are being led to believe that Egyptians were not Black. But if we think about authors like Cheikh Anta Diop, he specifies that Egyptians were Black-skinned. And so they were African people. What does it mean for Black people to know that Egyptians were Black-skinned, as Cheikh Anta Diop says? That means that the pyramids, that all of the amazing forms of intellectualism and what's considered pinnacles of civilization actually came from African people. That's why a lot of the statues and things like that, the nose has been blown off, because they don't want you to see that a lot of the Egyptian foundations had African features. But through an Afrocentric school of thought and frame of reference, we know that our people literally built this and know this and things like that. Another element to think about when we think about Afrocentricity, is that Malefi Kete talks about how there are no African universities in continental Africa. And that's because a lot of them are taught through Eurocentric lens. And I talk a lot about that in my dissertation because I did go to Tanzania. I did a lot of my fieldwork in Tanzania. And when I went to one of the Catholic schools, I saw row your boat on the school chalkboard, which was, ironic for a variety of reasons. A primary one being that it's American or Eurocentric nursery rhyme. But more ironically enough, they were experiencing droughts in that area of Tanzania. So I'm not sure what boats they were rowing at all, because they didn't have drinking water at the minimum, certainly not enough water to be rowing a boat of any kind. So all of these tools or ways of thinking provide us with tools to think about how we imagine African people and certainly Afrocentricity. So now we're going to be applying everything I said to a media source, a screenshot of a web page that I'm very familiar with, and a web page that I use a lot for my research. So again, how can we apply this tool? Through looking at this media page and being able to decipher it. So I'm going to actually let a little time run while we take some time to look at this page. As you can see, it's named female genital mutilation, taken directly from the World Health Organization, a coveted website. It has the date February 2024 on there, and it lists some key facts. Now, I want you to read all of the key facts. I want us particularly to focus on that first bullet, but I want us to think about what might be wrong about what's being said on this webpage, with a particular emphasis on that first bullet. I have a lot that I'm going to critique on this webpage, but that first bullet, I would say, irks me the most. So let's take a pause, read those bullets, and think about what may be going wrong. So I have on this next page some things that I personally highlighted. If you are streaming this at a later date, I would suggest pausing it here and maybe looking through this particular page in more detail if I'm going too fast. So as you can see from my notes, some things worthy of highlighting is the fact that mutilation, the word mutilation is used, and in their first key fact on the World Health Organization page, they say that more than 230 million girls and women alive today have undergone female genital mutilation in 30 countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, where FGM is practiced. So we want to deconstruct the use of that term mutilation to even begin with. I'll have a comparison of terminology on the next slide. So we'll really deconstruct why that sort of terminology should not be used at all. But even if we pause with the Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, first of all, they're using gigantic land masses to attribute a practice to. Also, why is this practice of so-called mutilation, right, which I would argue is a problematic term in and of itself, why is that only happening in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, when we know to be true from the Office on Women's Health that female genital cutting, which is my preferred terminology, I'll explain why, also happens in the United States. In fact, as we can see on this very slide, again, screenshotted from the Office on Women's Health page, researchers estimate that more than 513,000 girls and women in the US have experienced or are at risk of female genital cutting. So if we know those numbers to be true, why has the World Health Organization not included that information on its website? But apparently only people are being mutilated in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. So the Afrocentric tool, as I talked about in my previous slides, can be used to reimagine these very web pages, these websites that we consume daily, that tell us lies about ourselves, that tell us that female genital mutilation, right, which we could argue is what I like to call alienizing terminology, because it immediately alienates African young women to be outside of their body. I'll go into detail with that more in the next slide. But how can we say that only happens in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East when these exact numbers on a more accurate website tell us otherwise? We have to have a critical eye in the information we consume, and again, deconstruct what it is telling us about ourselves. So my preference, as I said, is cutting. Some people like to say circumcision. I don't like to use that terminology either because it equates it to male circumcision when there are no known health benefits to female genital cutting versus there's a list of health benefits to circumcision. So I also do not like to use that term unless absolutely necessary, and decided not to include it in this presentation. But certainly in terms of mutilation, we know, based on what I've already said, that term is condemnatory of the humans behind the practice. So when we think about the fact that other African women or Black women are in fact doing the so-called mutilating, it really makes them seem as other, as non-human when we call them mutilators. So I do not like to use that terminology at all. And I argue that it renders the practice as primitive versus attributing humanity to the people who are engaging in the practice. And so that's really an Afrocentric interpretation to thinking about how we think about female genital cutting, because when we think about the practice through an Afrocentric lens, we can only see the women and girls as human, and so they can't be mutilating one another. They can't be seen as other because they're the center of their own phenomena and they're capable of telling their own stories. I prefer to use cutting because, as I highlight, it's a more precise term and it opens the opportunity to return agency to the young women. So cutting allows a more open space for more conversation to happen, because mutilation really silences. It stops the conversation right there and says that these women are primitive, alien, other, and we should go away with them because they do this mutilating to themselves and others. Versus cutting really opens the space for a larger dynamic conversation to happen about the people, the humans behind everything that's going on, the people and the humans that are impacted by the larger implications of a society that we all live in and are all a part of. And I like that openness to conversation, that empathetic lens that using that terminology opens and provides this space for. So there is the danger of a single story when we do not tell the stories of African young women who are impacted by female genital cutting across the globe, not just in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, but young women across the globe. There is the danger of a single story when we do not tell the stories effectively because we say they're mutilated and we cast them to be perpetual victims, as I say, in need of saving from the West. That is what that terminology also does by saying that young women are mutilated. It implies that they need their white savior to save them from their primitivity, which we know not to be true. And as I like to say, the West is in no position to be doing any saving. It has a lot of deconstructing and self-work to do in and of itself. So by allowing the space and the window for young women across the globe to tell their own narratives, and by seeing young women throughout continental Africa and again throughout the globe as agents of their own reality, their stories become emblems of magic that transcend space and time. In my description for the course, I talked about how young women's stories have the potential to cut through algorithms because, as I showed in the World Health Organization website, these algorithms are repeating monolithic or singular stories about Black women throughout continental Africa. And so when we allow their truths and their authentic stories to take precedence, we really cut through the lies that are told about them and allow their spoken word to be truly magical. And as I like to say, their words produce a word magic, also known as nomo. So there's an Afrocentric term and concept called nomo, which means word magic. And it really implies the power that happens through spoken word and when it's stated and said in a room, and the magnitude of empowerment that can happen when speech is spoken. And I like to relate that to the call and response that's popular in storytelling and really reminiscent of an African indigenous way of knowing. So when we can say a story and when we can have a response, there's magic in that. And so there's magic when Black young women can say their stories and can speak it into existence. I like to say, to extend the Afrocentric term of no more word magic, I like to say that a magic is being produced. And I'm a big fan of this book called Children of Blood and Bone by a Nigerian author called Tomi Adeyemi. And she has a character that really curates magic as they're speaking. And I think the similar word magic happens when young women across the globe are able to tell their stories through their own lens and in their own words. It has the capacity to proliferate time-space continuums in galaxies far, far away, which brings me to this really magical slide and magical piece from a Black author in Pittsburgh. So, as I said, we are the magic, we are the phenomena, and our words has a potential to decipher algorithms and proliferate time and space continuums. So that is all. If we have time for questions, I'm more than open to answering them. I did not see them in the chat though, so.
Hey, oh my God. Hold on, let me make sure I'm not echoing. I might need you to mute a little bit. Let me mute you.
I got you.
I'm sitting here nodding along. Y'all can't see me because I'm in the backstage. And I'm sitting here nodding along and I'm posting this online because I'm just like, yo, she is dropping jewels and gems right now. And I know we have some students that are watching and I'm so excited about that. If anybody has any questions, definitely let us know. Shout out to the Free Black Women's Library. I just want to give them some love because they have curated this space in Brooklyn where people can go and they can get all these wonderful books written by Black women. And there's a space there, event space, people can come and exchange books. So I just want to shout her out. And I see that she's in the chat. Courtney, this was fantastic. And I think it is the perfect way for us to kick off Sankofa Summer School, because as people take these other classes, they need to understand what Afrocentricity is. And I think you gave us a lens through which we can understand why, this is important. I always appreciate when you break down the difference between cutting and mutilation, because I don't think that enough people have even stopped to think about the implications of it. So I think that what you just said was really important. I'm not sure. I don't think we're going to have many questions, and that's okay. If you are watching this after the fact, you can definitely post questions here. We'll check in or what have you. You can email us at info@sankofasummerschool.com. You had a comment. Thank you so much for this, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Carr. Can you recommend a text for beginners to introduce folks to Afrocentric thought, please? Girl, what do we do? There's so many. Let me go get my library right here. Hold on. I'm sitting next to my library. What do you think? What can we recommend to them?
I'd say the Afrocentric Manifesto is a real key piece for me. That's something that I lean on a lot.
Yes. I'm looking at all these books. Yeah, here we go.
The Afrocentric School by Nadav is also a pop-in piece to think about how we're integrating Afrocentricity into K-12 curriculums. Yeah. All that good stuff.
Yeah, I got it here. So this is Afrocentricity. This is the actual book. This is from 1980. It's been updated. You see, I got all my tabs and stuff. It's been updated several times. I think Dr. Asante, this came out in 1980. We're talking 40 some odd years ago. He has shifted his perception on queer identity, for example. So this is from 1980. I just want people to be clear that when they read this, that Dr. Asante no longer subscribes to some of these ideas as they relate to LGBT.
I also have this one right next to me.
The Afrocentric idea. Okay. See how we just be ready. Right. The Afrocentric idea. Hold on. While we sharing books.
Being human being.
Shake out to Europe, pre-colonial Black Africa. Please read this. What else we got?
Sheik Anta Diop's Civilization or Barbarism.
Barbarism, yep. And then the cultural unity of Black Africa.
Yep.
There's so we got books, and you know what I think I'll do? I think at the end of the session, after the third week, I'm gonna send out a reading list for everyone, and I will ask my instructors to send me books that they think students should read, and I will compile a master list of books that you all can read about all the things that we're going to be talking about. So how's that sound? I will email everyone that, because I love that. And I'll probably make a video where we post that. And that way, in case people happen across us, right? They didn't register, but maybe they happen across us, they'll have that information. Okay, I'm looking at the chat. Thank you for this. I came late and need to rewatch. So part of why we shifted to this particular model is so that we can just go right back and just watch it. And it's there and it's available for everyone. Appreciate your session, Dr. Carr. Great question about reading materials. Yes, jotting down recommendations. Thank you so much. We see y'all in the chat. We really appreciate you. Again, Sankofa Summer School, this is our 4th year, and we are constantly growing. So your feedback is so important. And when you guys ask for things like that, it's like, oh, I didn't even think. Why don't I put together a reading list? So we really appreciate you. I just want to thank Dr. Courtney Carr once again, one of my personal heroes in getting us to think differently about how we talk about sisters on the continent. And your work is outstanding and amazing. And I'm so grateful that you have returned to Sankofa Summer School and you've dropped this knowledge on us. And so I will pull you out real quick and just address people. If you, this is your first time engaging Sankofa Summer School, you see what we're about. You see what the knowledge is. You see the gems that are dropped. This education is open for everyone, and we want to make sure people get it. So make sure that you tell your friends. They can still register. They can still join. And we are here. And we're for the next 3 weeks, we are going to be dropping knowledge bombs on you. Okay. So come back and we hope to see you there. All right, everybody. Take care. Thank you.